thank you everybody for being here to another week on Quantum TikToks from the kitchen. In this case, Joe is talking from his office / library in his home. I think he just wants to make me look bad how many books he has, and I cannot compete with that. But Joe is the last one of not the last one, but the most recent friend that I'm bothered to join me in this. As I mentioned many times, the intention of this is an opportunity for us to come together to talk about things and discuss things that we find interesting. And each of the speakers is with total freedom. They get to choose whatever they want to talk about it and in whatever context. But it's to the eyes of the designer. They don't pretend to be scholars or anything like that. It's more like a kitchen talks, as we call it, an informal talk, and everybody talks for 20 to 25 minutes. Many of you have been here already, so you know how this goes. So, and Joe Day, everybody knows, he teaches SCI-Arc, but also he's a prolific writer and the king of the diagrammatic analysis of contemporary culture, but also one of the most illustrated and sophisticated thinkers I know in the world of architecture in relation to art. So when we were talking about, we thought that to have some kind of a context between the relation of art and architecture, which is always very much present, but it was a good topic for it. So that's a little bit what we talk about it, and so it's with great pleasure that we have Joe here. So Joe, the Zoom screen is yours.
Hernán, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to just sort of connect with everybody at SCI-Arc. And May is a funny month. This is usually a month when SCI-Arc is sort of off my radar, and it's nice to be on it tonight. And you know, Hernán, we were talking about it a little bit, and you'd mentioned that one of your talks was on bacon, and that was the one that I sort of ran with as an idea most as I was trying to kind of figure out what I'd like to share. Actually, frankly, what I'd just like to be thinking about these days. And I think, you know, our friendship, and I think it's true of a lot of my friendships in architecture and to a certain degree outside of it, have to do with a kind of shared enthusiasm for different artists. I have a whole bunch of friends that are basically my Duchampian friends, like the friends that love Marcel Duchamp in one way or another. And when we're together, you know, we have a certain language that we tip into around Duchampian things. I have some Ed Ruscha friends. Actually, for a long time, I'm not sure they were friends, but the Donald Judd enthusiasts, you'll find there are plenty of those in Los Angeles, and worth understanding where they come from. Actually, now they're friends. In any case, I feel like there's a kind of in our field, in architecture, I feel like there are these complicated taste cartographies that happen around contemporary and modern art that often kind of shape how we see our field. And I think SCI-Arc is sort of uniquely positioned as a school to actually, I think all schools humor that kind of enthusiasm for art out of architecture, but I think SCI-Arc really, you know, encourages it in a unique way. And at times in its 50-year history has imagined that there was no difference between the two. That art and architecture were all kind of the same pursuit, which is still I think a brave and heroic position to take, though a hard one necessarily to execute on. But what I wanted to talk about tonight was specifically a passion of mine that actually I stumbled into just as I was figuring out where I was going to grad school, and ended up spending most of my time in school trying to kind of get myself better educated about two artists. And then I ended up doing my thesis work on them. And one of, actually, it turned out, let me do this over some stuff to look at, if you don't mind. I'm gonna share a screen. These were the two artists I was talking about. And in the very late 1980s, I stumbled on work by, on the left, Roberto Mota, who was a late addition to the Surrealist group. In the 40s and the 50s, he became a very active and actually, in many respects, a kind of defining character within Surrealism. And he was famous for paintings like this one that combined a whole bunch of different representational techniques that looked sort of vaguely familiar to me. And it turned out they were familiar to me as an undergrad architect because Roberto Mota had trained as an architect and then moved to France to work in Le Corbusier's studio, and was lured out of architecture and into fine art by Salvador Dali and André Breton, and joined the Surrealist group and ended up writing treatises against his former employer, Le Corbusier, and developed a very singular and I think, to me, still compelling language for looking at how spatial ambiguities, how three-dimensional spatial ambiguities and representation can be captured in two. And I think, Hernán, this was it's Mota who, frankly, I think has a more compelling rhyme with your work than his son, Gordon Mota Clark, who's on the right. And on the right is, so I should say, Roberto Mota's painting there is called The Vertigo of Eros. And like a lot of surrealist paintings, it had a kind of Freudian double entendre title, like many of his paintings do. On the right is Gordon Mota Clark's work, The Conical Intersect. And this is a conical boring into a Parisian row house, a row house that was being cleared to make way for the Pompidou Center in the 1970s. So this was, Conical Intersect was performed actually in 1975, which in Mota Clark's very, very, very brief and sort of tragic, almost all of Mota Clark's cuttings for better or for worse, I think you will, like, over the course, Mota Clark has achieved a certain kind of ubiquity in architecture. Almost all the cuttings you'll see of his work were performed between 1975 and 1978, 1974 and 1978. He sadly he died of pancreatic cancer at the age of 37. So Roberto Mota and Gordon Mota Clark both had, Mota Clark in particular had a huge and first retrospective of his work in 1988 that I stumbled into as I was just finishing college and trying to figure out graduate school. And over the course of my time in school, I got more familiar with Gordon Mota Clark and Roberto Mota's work, and developed this kind of internal, a kind of personal conspiracy theory that was based on their family relationship with Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp had actually was Gordon Mota Clark's godfather and had championed Roberto Mota's painting to the point of getting the Museum of Modern Art to collect it. And Giovanni Piranesi, whose work was the only architect who both Roberto Mota, who had studied architecture in Chile before leaving it for fine art, and Gordon Mota Clark, who had studied architecture at Cornell before leaving the field for fine art, following Robert Smithson in much the way that his father had followed Dali. Piranesi was the one architect that they both agreed that they liked. And I'm sorry, I'm digging my way back into some familiar territory here, but in terms of tonight's talk, one of the things I really wanted to talk about, and Hernán, I was thinking that you had a couple of different talks, but you spoke about Bacon and looked at a couple of others. I think I would really encourage all of this, I mean, my friends, but certainly all the students to explore an artist's work in depth and to find some dialogue and rapport with it in your own work. But actually what I think is sort of kind of uniquely useful is not to look at one, but to look at two. And for me, this kind of shared fixation with Roberto Mota and Gordon Mota Clark, I think was for me far more fruitful than being really, really interested in either one of them would have been. For me, the questions that arose between their work, in fact, for the first couple of months, I was aware of both of their projects. I didn't know or didn't kind of quite acknowledge that they were related. I certainly didn't realize that Mota Clark was Mota's son for a couple of months. And in that period of thinking about these two artists whose work I was intrigued by, I started to draw connections and find both filiations, but also important differences between them. And I think it's actually the differences as much as the similarities. You know, you'll certainly, if you look to art to reinforce your appetites as a designer or as an architect, you will absolutely at this point find myriad artists who share something with your sensibility, and you can learn something important about it. But I would actually encourage you to kind of look for a dialogue within the arts or between them. It could be an artist and a filmmaker, or an artist, across the arts. But I would encourage you to look at, especially for those of you heading into thesis, for you to look at it in terms of a dialogue more than a kind of single, rather than a single immersion into a sensibility. I think you'll learn more, and that dialogue will kind of continue, for better or for worse, will kind of play out probably for the rest of your life. So Roberto Mota and Gordon Mota Clark were these two. Actually, to be fair here, Piranesi and Duchamp were actually obsessions of my undergraduate studies. I had been an architecture and a political philosophy student, and Piranesi and Duchamp and Adolphe Loos and Lequeux, that whole outer ring of characters, was for me really interesting in terms of how modernity and the Enlightenment in architecture and in politics had these characters that played to both sides of my interest. And so the Motas helped me make sense of that. And out of that kind of quadratic of the two Motas and Duchamp and Piranesi, these are two of about 10 different diagrams I did to try to kind of make sense of what they were doing, how, what was different or what was similar about what they were doing. And so the one on the left is looking at them in terms of kind of philosophical movements or aesthetics. I think if you know Duchamp's work well and Loos, they are related in terms of their relationships both to Dada on the one hand, and I think actually a rather unique fixation on literalism, so that the toilet becomes the fountain for Duchamp, and Adolphe Loos I think plays some similar language games. But as you go around that constellation, I think those interests are shared. And then on the right, and this is actually where I think it's important, and I have a friend, Frances Richard, who I hope will join us in this conversation a little later, but she's written a phenomenal book this last year. The other great book on Mota Clark of 2019 is Frances's, and it's this one. And where Mark Wigley really looked in an incredibly, so Mark's is here, sorry, I'll do that. This is my, if I'm gonna have to talk to people from my library, I'm gonna throw books at them. But this is Mark Wigley's book, good to own if you're interested in Mota Clark. Frances's book is fantastic, and it's principally about how language figures in Mota Clark's work. And I think actually this is where as designers, if you look at artists, one of the ways to look at art and not simply kind of sample its aesthetics, but actually to engage it on a more substantive level, is often through different filters. But one good filter is language, because all artists, even the ones that call every single work untitled, take a stance towards the use of language that will rhyme in some way into how architects use language. And we use it differently. I think it's one of the ways in which art and architecture aren't so easy to collapse into one another. And I think that distance is useful. But what I got interested in this, the diagram on the right, was just how, the kind of language forms that these different artists used, and they were strange, fantastic idioms. I don't know if many of you are familiar with Lequeux, but there was a remarkable show of these drawings that he did, and he was an Enlightenment painter that made these they're sort of perverse plays on Ledoux and Boulez, and also worth a look. But kind of, I was interested in how different language formats help these artists think about what they wanted to produce. And I think at this particular moment going into thesis, this might be the last best time to think about how you are discussing your work and how that can help you kind of produce it and diversify it in useful ways. What I ended up doing with my thesis was looking really, really intensively at 4 works, one work apiece for these 4 artists. And I will tell you that this constraint to a close reading of 3 works was due utterly and completely to Sylvia Lavin, who at a certain point, when I was just Mota obsessed and throwing all of these images and all this work and all these ideas at her, said, "Joe, I will only speak with you about one work." And it helped. It was brutal for me, but I got the work down to just one thing to look at per artist. And it really, the whole art of close reading, and Jeff Kipnis is a master of it, but there are many others, just looking really, really carefully at a single work rather than kind of absorbing the sensibility of an artist's oeuvre is really valuable. And so in this case, I looked at Marcel Duchamp's Large Glass, and the little one on the right is one of the Carcieri series by Piranesi. I was fascinated by that one because it's got an Escher triangle in the middle. It's a perspective that doesn't work, which I was interested in. And up above is Mota's Splitting the Ergo, and below is Mota Clark's triple photograph collage of Circus. And basically in every one of those, in each of those 4 works, I tried to hold myself to a threshold of looking at them both as 2-dimensional patterns and as 3-dimensional representations of depth. And then I developed a kind of series of drawing strategies for kind of fleshing out those two different ways of seeing. So basically, and this is another point I would make, that like, I think it's worth looking at 2 artists rather than one. And I think while you're doing your thesis, not necessarily during it, but for later, keep track of all the trajectories out of those 2 artists. Because in my case, that weird diagram in the middle of this image is Richard Hamilton's map of the large glass. And Richard Hamilton in the last 10 years has been a much more compelling artist to me in a lot of ways than the Motas are at this point in my life. Richard Hamilton is a fascinating figure and a real interlocutor for Marcel Duchamp in the United States, and actually oddly a connection to Rainer Banham as well. But he connects a lot of dots later in my life. But he had done a very elaborate analysis of the large glass that I tried to echo. And on the far right, that edge, those drawings on the edge are Manfredo Tafuri's analysis of another Carcieri etching by Piranesi. And that series is a really important, within his big book, which is this one, The Sphere and the Labyrinth. So in The Sphere and the Labyrinth, Manfredo Tafuri, Sphere and Labyrinth. This is a really weird way to talk. I'm going to cut to the chase.
No, you can do it. You can do it later when you stop sharing the screen so we can see it bigger.
Oh, of course. In any case, Tafuri argues that the impossibility of Piranesi's Carcieri are where utopian speculation by architects becomes a failed utopian project. Because they are spatially impossible, the whole utopian hunger amongst architects is sort of is undermined, not flawed, by this fallibility. Anyway, God, I knew this was going to get. Anyway, these are the drawings I did. So this was an analysis of the other Piranesi. On the left is sort of the graphic patterning of it, and on the right is a perspectival derivation of what's called a Penrose triangle in that image. So that there's a Gothic arch that plays in sort of 2 planes that you can't. Yeah, I'm sure. All right. These were some models I built to try to kind of flesh that out. A similar series with Mota Clark, where I got really obsessed with the very specific staging of his photo collages. And what was remarkable to me, or important to me about Mota Clark's photo collages, is that unlike David Hockney, they weren't all taken from a single point of view, or even with a really he took them from strange locations and then recomposed them in in a way that actually added another spatial complexity to them. This was for splitting the ergo. And then these were basically I tried to find ways to build this analysis up towards, I wanted a building proposal, and you don't always have to have one, but I wanted one. So I ended up making these machines for looking at the series I was interested in. So these were the Carceres on this kind of radial crossbow. These were Roberto Mota's inscapes, paintings like Splitting the Ergo, that were supposed to be his psychological interiors, how you'd look at those. This is the large glass in Duchamp and all of the his earlier works that factor, and I didn't realize this until I built this thing. There are 5 or 6 earlier projects of Duchamp that all filter into the large glass at precise scale. So part of the reason he built it out of glass was so that he could trace his earlier work directly into it, which interested me. And this was sort of how the thesis got unfurled. I got lucky. I did this in the year SCI-Arc moved from one building to another, so I had a lot more room than I usually do. Anyway, that's one thing. And I'm going to escape here. And talk just briefly. So that was what I wanted to do was 2 things. That's the longer of the 2. But I wanted to try to use Gordon Mota Clark, and I realized I haven't given you much biographical information. He's, if you're not familiar with his work, it would take more than this 20 minutes to get you there, but he's an important artist in his generation in what are called within post-minimalism, or specifically post-gallery practices. So Gordon Mota Clark would be a very important figure amongst a kind of constellation of artists that left galleries behind and started producing work outside of galleries. And he follows, importantly, on the heels of Robert Smithson in that trajectory out of the white cube of the gallery and into the landscape. And he has a lot of peers in that act. And so as much as my fixation on Mota Clark was based on this odd double architects into fine art family obsession, more generally, you will find Mota Clark is invoked in terms of his peers and how they got out, how they left the gallery, and how to a certain degree they started practicing something very much like architecture or against architecture, or started using architecture as medium. So I'm going to go through this one really quickly. Pardon me a sec. How am I doing for time, Hernán? Am I burning? It's long, huh?
You're doing fine. Go as long as you want. No problem.
I'll be quick. I mean, honestly, this really is, and I don't have the same kind of. Honestly, this was a compilation I put together to give students a little bit of a background in this generation of artists who I think in all the time I've been teaching, the cohort of minimalist and especially post-minimalist artists are invoked all the time, and they are because a lot of the time they're using our field as a medium for their own. And in Mota Clark's case of cutting buildings, it's very direct, but that it was equally so in a whole diversity of practices. So 3 I sort of grabbed out of dozens that would be easy contenders to talk about would be Mota Clark, Dan Graham, and Rachel Whiteread, who is actually closer to our generation. Dan Graham and Mota Clark would have been almost exact contemporaries, and both of them are very kind of critically influenced by Robert Smithson. Dan Graham more kind of in dialogue with him. But in any case, in this context, I'd be looking at Mota Clark more in terms of a kind of the kind of rarefied representation of his work, and how he on the one hand outlined what his work was going to do in a diagram like the one on the left, and on the other hand kind of documented its effects in these collages on the right. He also did basically I was interested here in not only Mota Clark. In the 90s and the early aughts, you only saw Mota Clark in the buildings he cut up. In the last 10 years, the scholarship around Mota Clark has gone to everything but that. And the cuttings on the left of, he would basically make these, he would take drawing pads and slice through them to generate these drawings. And they were kindred in some ways with a project like Bingo on the right, where he took different pieces out of this farm building. And one of the things that interested me about Mota Clark in both registers was that he was enacting forms of architectural representation. That in Bingo, you see the elevation, you see an elevation being taken and taken apart and going from an elevation to a section in that building, or in a splitting a precise kind of cross section being taken. These are more of those. This one, well, here, this is the one piece of, oh, I can't even do it. All right, I'm not going to show you my analysis of that one on the left. But Rachel Whiteread. So Rachel Whiteread often, and I feel like this is sort of a standard jury ploy, but you should know it as students. Rachel Whiteread and Gordon Mota Clark are easily complementary. Where Mota Clark sliced through buildings, Rachel Whiteread cast out of them. So she would take defunct buildings in the same way that he did, but rather than making incisions and removals, she pours into those interiors and uses the husks of old buildings basically as her molds or as her formwork. And so this is a staircase that she poured. These are pieces of, this is a row house on the right, and actually I think this might be related distributions of the same castings. In any case, Rachel Whiteread is, I think, fascinating in a very different way. And if I'm not mistaken, Florencia did a lot with Rachel Whiteread recently in one of her studios. In between, so Dan, we're going to come up on Dan Graham quickly.
He's giving you the approval, Florencia.
What?
Florencia is saying yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to go quick. There are other artists that are important. I believe it's actually Robert Morris in the middle, and Blinky Palermo is an interesting character that doesn't usually come up in the art and architecture discussion because he's more of a colorist and a painter, but he did some really important work that were literal derivations of buildings. And this one in particular is one I love. It's a gallery in Dusseldorf, I think, where he simply took the pattern of the exterior window and kind of rotated it into the interior as a basis for his painting there. And this one too is for Florencia. We did a talk on Larry Bell, and Larry Bell's glazed. Another way to frame the art and architecture discussion is in terms of enclosures. And in particular, I've spent a lot of time looking at glass boxes and glass houses and how they do or don't rhyme with each other. And this all gets you to Dan Graham. So that's Larry Bell's cube on the left and Damien Hirst's cowhead on the right. And in between is Dan Graham, who built these sort of strange, often glazed or mirrored constructs that usually had to do with putting people in odd relationships with one another and with new media. And Dan Graham is somebody who, I guess that's back to Larry Bell for the moment. This is Dan Graham. Dan Graham is someone that I think SCI-Arc students should know better. I think Dan Graham has a lot of untapped potential. Dan Graham is also somebody who in terms of the cultures of SCI-Arc and CalArts, really has, I feel like Dan Graham is a bridge figure there that we should know better. And these are Dan Graham's pavilions. Dan Graham built a pavilion on top of the Díaz Center in New York that is a better riff on Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth house than Philip Johnson's was. And this is Damien Hirst, but I think I will wrap that up. And I think let's see here. Figure out how to.
Yeah, just stop sharing screen and that's it.
Got it. So that's a little bit of what I'm hoping I've done in brief is, if Mota Clark is sort of a nodal figure, I wanted to take kind of two passages through his role or his potential in terms of being an interlocutor between art and architecture.
Yeah, I think, Joe, thank you. That was really, really great. This is the moment that we invite, if people who are watching YouTube want to join us here for the conversation part. A couple of things that come to mind. One, first, thank you for Revindicate Dan Graham. I think he's an extraordinary artist, sometimes get overlooked a little bit. For those of us who have the chance to see the installation in the Díaz Foundation, he was really an extraordinary piece. But I want to ask you something more in relation to some of the things that you show about your work in relation to it. And there is something, I'm for sure I'm misreading this, but maybe to start the conversation a little bit between what we're talking about art and architecture. One thing I find fascinating is you tend to gravitate, not all of them, but some of the artists that you analyze for your own work and so on, they tend to be what I will call artists in the kind of a clever or a strategic way to produce art. But then the analysis that you do is incredibly complex and technique driven, using representation almost in the opposite side that the artists use it. So in a way, like it's not the same, but the analysis that Richard Hamilton did is a completely different animal than the thing itself. So I'm finding interesting because in a way, I will say your representation, some of the analysis you were doing is rooted in kind of a morphosis and Frank Israel and some of the kind of the technique virtuosity of representation, which it seems like an interesting friction between a body of work that not necessarily rely on virtuosity per se, but it gets translated by an exercise of virtuosity and representation. So I'm really fascinated by that. And I wonder if that's one of the ways to start to think in the relation between, in the same way that you were talking about looking at two artists, and maybe the natural way to do like the most clear relationship between art and architecture is almost to operate with the opposite medium that the art that you're analyzing is doing. I don't know, there is something about that, but I'm really intrigued by that part.
Yeah, it's funny when I started into looking at the Motas and the work I did, the analysis I did at the time, I thought was just, very cool-headed. Like, how do I draw what's going on in this work in a way that kind of unpacks it in some kind of clear way? But it was in years where people came up with really elaborate excuses for complicated drawings, and I in some ways I miss those years. It's funny that I will show it now, but recently I revisited that technique of analyzing work a few years ago in my studio, just to kind of sort of improve our acuity for looking at things and analyzing them. But I think it's true. I think, Hernán, I think to the degree that I want to look at things carefully and portray them carefully, I think it does relate for me philosophically to something that is common amongst those four artists and maybe more broadly. Duchamp talks a lot about nominalism, and in nominalism, philosophically, nominalism is the idea that naming has sort of a power in its own right, and so the kind of poetic, strange, surrealist titles of things actually change the works of art that they're attached to, and what was remarkable about Roberto Mota in particular was that he pioneered the idea of spatial or representational nominalism. And that was really, my thesis was in a way about that. Roberto Mota would show this picture of just a box with a cross through it. And he would say, I look at this image and I can see a pyramid, I can see an endless hallway, or I can see a box that's been checked. And so simultaneously, and without being able to necessarily differentiate between these three, like this single image is operating in three valences. And I'm still really fascinated by that idea of a play between 2- and 3-dimensional representation and how it can alter how we understand space. I actually like the fact that it encourages a kind of ambiguity or doubt about one's surroundings, and I think it's something that a lot of writers, novelists talk a lot about, how you need doubt, and that's something that's what's behind that ambition.
Cool. I would like to open it now to everybody. I mean, either use the chat box to write questions I can ask to Joe, or you can just ask directly. I think it's however you feel like doing it. And if not, I can keep going, but I think I would like to open it to everybody else.
Anybody hate Gordon Mota Clark?
I don't. I like it quite a lot. Okay. Florencia has a question for you.
Thanks.
Joe, amazing as always. I hadn't seen the connection that you did between White Reed and Mata Clark, the kind of negative and positive. I don't think that is negative and positive, but I think it'd be great to kind of expand on the idea of the ready-made, which is the found building. You know how she found the houses that she cast, and he found houses that he could cut.
Yeah.
So cast and cut in a way. So I thought that was wonderful. I mean, I hadn't put them together, but there's the ready-made is a one-to-one. Not always, the ready-made is not always a one-to-one.
And that notion of kind of found a ready-made landscape. The original title of that was, and I felt like it was just too downbeat for the moment, but it was Malaise as Medium. And the idea that a lot of artists have, in Mata Clark's case, in the 70s, all these cities, American cities were in terrible shape, and finding buildings that you could, there's an amazing reconstruction of one of his projects going on right now called Day's End, where he cut a kind of almond-shaped aperture and a pier. But in both cases, there was this kind of transformation of neglected urban spaces and a kind of revesting of structures with kind of with new potential. And I do think I think a lot of artists manage that kind of alchemy in different ways. Frankly, a lot of my teaching the last 10 years has had more to do with filmmaking than fine art, or with the play between cinema and architecture. And I actually think that filmmakers almost inevitably kind of take that kind of stance towards the built environment.
Anybody else?
Joe, thank you. That was brilliant. I really enjoy hearing you lecture. It's great to have the opportunity. I was wondering, you mentioned a kind of shift in your thinking about the work of Richard Hamilton, and how you said, right now he's more important for my work maybe than Mata or Mata Clark. And I was curious, because I think, recently I've been reading Sadie Smith's book, Changing My Mind, which has a lot to do with how, as a writer, her kind of affinities for certain other authors maybe changed over time, the idea of revision or reconsideration. And I was wondering, maybe could you speak a little bit about that? I thought that was
Sure.
kind of
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. And it's funny, Richard Hamilton has been kind of a kind of distant horizon for me for a long time. I felt like I needed to understand his work better, and I keep kind of edging up against, especially having done some writing on Rainer Banham and the independent group. Richard Hamilton kind of keeps coming up in unexpected ways. But what I think I really like about him now that I didn't realize I would value in his practice as much as I do is just how heterogeneous it was, how he moved. He really wasn't an artist that did one thing for 40 years. He really did move from an early career as a photorealist painter, and some of his early canvases are really strange, really direct, kind of hyper realist landscape representations, to the collages that he was famous within the independent group of, that crazy apartment that I'm forgetting. It's got one of those great weird associative titles. But in that year, in the 50s, he got to know Duchamp and had, I think, himself this kind of come to Jesus moment where he spent a couple of years touring, getting Duchamp to California so that he could have his retrospective, and translating for him there, and translating all the notes in the green box. As an incredibly successful artist, he had this hiatus of a couple of years where he was really bringing Marcel Duchamp out of incredible obscurity in the late 50s and early 60s. And so I feel like there's actually an ethics to his work. And then he overlaps with J.G. Ballard in weird ways. And it's funny. I like, he's this sort of riddle that has stayed constant for me. I like all the work, and I still can't kind of connect the dots between all of it. And I feel like artists that keep you guessing are the ones that you really want to hold on to.
Anybody else?
Can I ask a question, maybe to get a rise? Was Roberto Mota's work familiar to any of the students?
We have a couple of no's. We have one yes.
Max, thank you, Max. So I ask in part because when I was doing that work on the Motas in the 90s, Roberto Mota was the artist that was really cresting in terms of his public reception and importance. And actually, through most of Gordon Mota Clark's life, his father was the major artist to who he was trying to kind of ante up to. And Gordon Mota Clark actually happened to be a twin, and his twin brother Baton Mota was considered actually the better artist of the two of them. Catherine Dreyer, a major collector, famously said, Mota, you have two sons, one's a prince and one's a farmer. And Mota Clark was the farmer. But Baton Mota the pressure of comparison with his father overwhelmed him. He died even earlier than Mota Clark, sadly. I guess actually the other figure I'd kind of throw in the mix, because she's amazing, is Anne Clark, who ended up Anne Alpert. But if you're one of the things I stumbled into in all that research was there were, surrealism, all the big 20th century avant-gardes were pretty bad in terms of including women, but surrealism at least occasionally did better than most. And Anne Clark had some amazing work in the 30s and 40s. And to me, the idea that a family could generate multiple brilliant people rather than simply always favoring the heroic genius was a really liberating idea at that point. We were talking, Hernán, about how, a lot of the artists, a lot of the architects we really respect, the better you get to know their work, the more you realize how much within a kind of family dynamic they often are.
Yeah.
If you got the family.
I would have a question.
Please, Christy. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. Sorry, I kind of ducked in late, but I'm hearing you kind of make those two comparisons. So I really just caught the last probably 10 minutes. So I don't have the setup. Just hearing what you were talking about, I've always, in my interest in kind of volume, I've been interested in Clark and Rachel for different reasons, but I've always connected them, but I've never looked to see if they have actual connections back to like Luigi Moretti and his interest, in some of his research of kind of casting volume, but then in some of his kind of built work, he definitely seems to really want to emphasize voids in pretty unique ways. And so I've always been interested in the possible triangulation between those three. And I just wondered if that's ever crossed your mind.
Not till now. And I'm embarrassed to say, I feel like I know Moretti sort of in a very like kind of familiar, but not well enough informed. But I feel like actually that I included that dyad of Whiteread and Mota Clark kind of for that reason, that it seems like it's sort of an over easy polarity, but it seems like there ought to be interesting third positions that I think, in terms of teaching, I think there are a lot of ways you could start to kind of make sense, not just in terms of a kind of solid void play, but even, and they do take very different attitudes towards the building material they use.
Sure.
And I think that maybe that one, if you don't mind, maybe I'll close with this, but I mean, it's staggering how many artists use architecture as their medium. Or pardon me 1 second. This it'll be quick, but
okay.
I'll be fast, but I think it's sort of an interesting.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I just, this one sort of like people you might be interested in or some possibilities. I was talking with a friend, with Francis, the author of Physical Poetics, on Mata Clark, and I said, you know, in terms of artists, it was a sort of deluge of artists that whose work stands in relationship to architecture in some kind of interesting way. And I would sort of leave this as the kind of riddle that I'm leaving tonight with. You know, she sent me this list, and I realized they're kind of like Judd isn't even on there, Doug Aiken, Olafur Eliasson. There's a whole kind of like competing for ambient environments group of artists that would be worth considering as well. But there's a lot there. And I think SCI-Arc, you know, and I think Hernán, if you don't mind, I'd end with a question to you on this, but I feel like SCI-Arc kind of plays between its fascination with and command of new technologies. And Devin, I think you're like the work of, you know, of your studios is always so incredible in terms of this, but it's true. I would say all of my favorite colleagues at SCI-Arc have this incredible command of new technological possibility, and at the same time a kind of abiding interest in a kind of cultural dialogue that usually involves, if not one of these artists, you know, somebody, and or some kind of constellation of them. And I think, Hernán, my question to you would be, in terms of the school and how those priorities get balanced or rebalanced, do you see some variation in terms of how SCI-Arc works there, or do you see different times that we're stronger in one respect or the other? And for students, what would you recommend how would you recommend they weigh that?
Let me put it this way. I think there is an ideological umbrella that there has been from the beginning of the school, that in many ways still is there. But I think many of our faculty interpret that in a different way. But for sure, at least I would argue that if there is a criteria that anybody who teaches SCI-Arc is, they all have that appetite to keep reclaiming the artistic value of architecture, and not necessarily, let's say, the most craftsmanship of professional side of architecture. So I think that's why I think we keep gravitating towards that. I think it's the notion of architecture as a cultural practice and not architecture necessarily only as a profession. So I would argue that not every faculty or every architect at SCI-Arc approach in the same way and so on. But I would argue that I would say that presence is somewhere every time there. I remember when I was a student many years ago in Argentina, one of my hardcore technical modernist teacher have in his office this quote from Cesar Pelli, of all people. And the Cesar Pelli quote was something like, if you squeeze architecture to the last drop, architecture is art. But what my professor cut out, that was a sentence that says asked, because even Cesar Pelli will say, and that is the essential mission of architecture. So even in the mass pragmatic thing, so I mean, yes, it's one drop, but that drop is the essential one. So I think this idea has been floating forever. But I think the flirtation between artists and architecture and the exchange, I think will have to do with, it's a very symbiotic relationship. I heard this personally, and Casey told me many times, but I heard Vito Acconci said this many times. Casey Rem worked for Vito Acconci, which is an interesting,
wow, I didn't realize that. That's
that Vito Acconci said many times, and as I said, I hear him to say that to me, I'd rather to be a bad architect than a great artist. So he was much more invested in being a bad, and I will say, if you ask many architects, will tell you the opposite.
Yeah,
I'd rather to be a bad artist than a great architect. I think there is a whole psychological component, and it's not a casualty that people like Wigley and some of the, let's say, the Princeton nurture of psychoanalysis, the one that they create those relationships. But I think in terms of expression, I personally, and I don't want to speak for everybody to say, I personally consider architecture should be on the art side more than anything else. But understanding that it's not art completely, and it shouldn't be art completely. But I think if you keep fighting for that part of architecture, I think you are in better shape. And in one way or another, I would argue that majority of the faculty find a way to convey that. But also I think we are expanding what art is today, which is it's probably a topic for another conversation, Joe, which is what is the status of it? Because I think sometimes we work too hard to also give the disciplinary patina or aura to art as well. And in that, I think sometimes we discard some, because I think some of the most contemporary artists that we bring into the conversation, they tend to be people rooted within the discipline and trajectories of art. And I think we have certain problems to really incorporate, like, I don't know how you will incorporate somebody like David Hammond in an architectural discussion. It's not an easy task. Or I mean, like, and even some of the contemporary architects and the contemporary artists, that architects we tend to talk and mention, and Hirsch and Kunz and so on, are not artists that are considered really radical or speculative artists in the art field. Are considered established figures. So there is a certain ambiguity. So, sorry, I'm not giving you a straight answer, because I don't think there is a straight answer for this. And I think it's this misunderstanding and misconstruction that architects we always do with the power is. We have a question from
sorry, I didn't
oh
see.
my God, it's Fatima. She's saying, sometimes I think studying architecture is much more fun than practicing in real life. Yeah, and what is the technical? No shit, yes, you're absolutely right. And I think that's what we all want to keep remaining involved in teaching, because it's a way to. I would not say it's avoiding reality. It's about creating another dimension of reality.
Yeah, and Fatima, I don't want to discount the. There's fun to be had out there. I mean, to be dead honest, in these next few years, it's going to be a strange few years, and in strange times. People will come up with unusual ways to practice and odd ideas for what to do with those practices. And it's funny, I didn't leave all that work on the Motas thinking I wanted to leave architecture for fine art. I love what we do. And I like even some of its limitations and some of its procedures, although I got to tell you, getting a building permitted does still drive me batshit crazy. But I do think, I think, I don't know. Yeah, you'll find a way to, I actually think like one of the great things about SCI-Arc is that you'll take out into the world some of your sensibility. I was thinking, Hernán, as you were talking, that my first couple jobs out of school, I'd find myself in these offices and everyone around me knew so much more about contemporary architects than I did, but none of them knew anything about art. And it was just sort of an odd, like, I wondered if I had really just, if I had somehow, but honestly, for better or for worse, I got to know enough about all those architects too. I caught up. Yeah. I think SCI-Arc actually allows for a certain kind of intellectual self-formation and eccentricity that will, I think, Fatima, you'll find a way to have a good time. I think knowing that you've got to look for it is important, because I think a lot of people get out of school and just sort of write off the first decade. We are in a profession where you do have to put in your time, and putting some time into practices that are just like putting some time into strange random practices has some value to it. But I would say, and this is a personal regret, that it's sort of a refrain for me, and it's a tricky time to be offering this because it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to get these, but I really would actually suggest you beg and plead if you can to work with people whose work you really respect. Hernán mentioned Frank Israel, and I sort of backed into working with Frank sort of accidentally, actually more through writing than design. But I look back now 25 years later at who I worked with, and the ones whose sensibility you really still want to make sense of are so much more, are a much more vital part of the rest of your life than the ones from which you're just getting skills or learning how to, I would work with somebody who runs a profitable office so you have some idea of how to do that. I wish I did, but work for people whose work you love. then do as much of your own as you can.
I think that's a really good note to finish. If nobody else has any other question.
I just have a quick comment. Joe, thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed all the things you shared, especially I think some of the projects and drawings from your thesis. I was really just struck by the way that you did the analysis of the drawings and the machines that you made to look at them. And just kind of wondering if there's any sort of cross-contamination of that previous analysis or that interest into your current work right now in your architectural office.
Yeah, it's a question I ask myself all the time, and this, I think it relates, Fatima, to yours as well in some ways, like how do you translate and how do you take it forward? And I'll be honest with Hernán. Hernán is a friend of mine because is one of the things I really respect about Hernán is that I can see a really clear continuity between his, what he was doing as a student and what he's doing now, read through really clearly. My answer is more complicated than that. And honestly, I do think, the work moves around. I mentioned that I was looking at those glass pavilions, and one of a couple houses that I'm really proud of at this point is, very much in that tradition. But I'm still, honestly, and actually a lot of our work the installation we did at SCI-Arc was related to film and projection, and the play between projection and perspective, which relates to that whole nominalist toggling that I'm interested in. So I almost always find ways to see my interests in the work, but I think being more decisive about making your interests drive the work is really valuable. And I plan to spend the rest of my life doing more of that. And once this book is out, I don't know. It's funny. One of the things I did, and Mota Clark's a very diversified artist, but I spent a few years with putting together a clothing line, partly on the argument that Mota Clark spent a couple of years building a restaurant in Soho and just doing something outside my expertise just to see what that would mean. I can connect all the dots, but I'm not sure it's self-evident, and I'd like it to be more so.
Okay, I think.
Wait, no, I got one.
Oh, go ahead, go, please.
Yeah, hi, Joe. I was just curious on that note that I was wondering how you navigate your own projects, your own project methodologies and your approach, and kind of, I think one of the things that I was most fortunate to have learned and observed from working with you was how you were able to mobilize your own personal interests into formal ideas. And I think this question of what constitutes a project has been super important for me to clarify my own interests. And I think throughout education, everybody works restlessly between the internal and external constraints of a project at any given time. But I think there's a point when those no longer become reactionary, but once it starts to feel reflexive, I guess I'm wondering, and I know that the training of a sensibility is a patient search, but I'm curious and I can't help but wonder what comes after that. So I guess.
And I think this is one of the values of looking at art practices are much more broad, much more diverse than architectural practices. I think I'd be thrilled if somebody could prove me wrong there, but I think artists just chase more ideas and more directions and more, actually with more monomania and focus. There are a lot of artists that really do only do one thing for 40 years, and that's how they work. But they're also artists, and I think, Hernán, to your point, I think I'd like to imagine. I think actually Mota and Mota Clark are in the trajectory with Duchamp of conceptual art, conceptualism. And so you have an idea and you try to make it manifest in different ways. And the degree to which it becomes manifest in really clearly aesthetically related ways, or just takes forms that are very hard to connect the dots between, is, a little bit, I think that's where things get tricky. And to be honest, I feel like I'm pretty good at conceptual frameworks, so I reverse engineer the rationale for things. And I would say actually there's some value in that, but there's a lot of value to having an idea or two and chasing them. And this comes up, I think, Hernán, you did a talk with Tom Main. Tom Main, there was a brilliant conversation that I hope is somewhere recorded between Tom Main and Bernard Schumi and this really will close this up, but it's a good one. Sylvia Lavin had a show called Everything Loose Will Land at the Max Center a few years ago as part of the Pacific Standard Time show. That's a catalog really that takes up this art and architecture and technology question at a fever pitch of sophistication, really worth looking at. So she got Tom Main and Bernard Schumi to have a conversation. And going into that, I think everyone thought Bernard Schumi was going to tear apart Tom Main. Bernard Schumi has 5 books. Well, they both have a lot of books, but Shumi's got, Shumi's career has a real conceptual integrity. What he was interested in and what he's done, he can connect all the dots. And the dots go in a lot of different directions. He's got a lot of diagrams and he's built a lot of them. Tom Main came in and said, Bernard, I feel like I've been haunted by one of your diagrams. Like I looked at your project for Parc La Violette and I spent the next 10 years unpacking it. And this is how that unpacking worked. And he showed that decade of unpacking Bernard Schumi's pretty good idea and how far he took it. And it was amazing. And frankly, just project by project, it was not a great night for Bernard Schumi. And I think that idea of just boring in on a question and taking its possibilities seriously and taking them as far as they can is really valuable. For what it's worth, that's the advice I leave all of you that I'm also trying to internalize.
Thank you, Jose. Fantastic.
My pleasure. Sorry to.
No, it was great. Fantastic. Thank you so much for doing it. And to everybody else, until next week, and we'll figure it out what we can with up for next Wednesday. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so
much.
much.
Thank you, Joe.
Really,
Bye.
my pleasure. Thanks. Really means a lot.
Thanks.
Have a good night.